This session is reverse engineering the Supra iBox exploitation of a hardened MSP430 based device. And your speaker today is Braden Thomas. So with that, take it away.
Hello everyone, and welcome to reverse engineering the Supra iBox. My name is Braden Thomas. I'm a senior research scientist at Accuvant, where mainly I these days focus on embedded devices, reverse engineering, and exploit development. Prior to Accuvant, I worked at Apple Product Security, so I have a very software-based perspective on hardware attacks. Today we're going to talk about the Supra iBox. So I'll show you what the iBox is. We'll talk about the Android app that accompanies the device. I'll show you how to open the device, perform firmware extraction, which techniques I used and which techniques I tried to use. We'll cover the findings, and then I'll show you a couple demos. But before we get into all that, let's talk about why this is interesting. With Kickstarter and the Internet of Things, you're seeing a lot more devices being created. There's just a massive proliferation of embedded devices. But at the same time, there's this increased scrutiny on security. And with these devices being created on a shoestring budget, they want to incorporate security in some sort of cryptographic protocol and exchange, but they're storing manufacturers are storing secrets in general purpose microcontrollers, which is super cheap and easy, but it's not necessarily the best idea. And the iBox is a great case study of why that is. And finally, because when you perform these attacks, you can hack into houses, and that's just inherently cool. So what is the iBox? It's a real estate physical key container. If you've ever bought a house, you've most likely seen one of these, as it's number one in the market. The competition is CentralLock. Basically, when you're selling a house, you put your keys inside and you hang it on your door. And other agents can come up, they can open the iBox with their smartphones. There's three models currently on the market. There's the older iBox, which has been around for a long time. It's IR based only. There's the newer Bluetooth iBox, which uses legacy Bluetooth. And then there's the Bluetooth LE model, which just came out this past year. Now, to actually open one of these devices, you're going to need a key. And the traditional key was called the active key. It incorporates a cell radio inside of it. But almost everyone these days uses eKey, which is an iOS and Android app, because it's you don't have to pay for an extra cell radio plan. Now, you're most likely also going to be using a dongle or a key fob. Dongle if you're using an iPhone, for example, and you're trying to communicate over legacy Bluetooth, or a key fob if you're trying to communicate over IR. So they have these Bluetooth to IR key fobs. So first, the Android app. I went after the Android app because it's obviously super easy to decompile and reverse engineer. I focused on their authentication algorithm to open the key box. And what I immediately discovered is that each key has a serial number and a syscode, is what they call it. Now, a syscode is just an integer that represents the geographical market that the key can be used in. For example, I'm from Atlanta, and Atlanta has a single syscode. And some larger metropolitan areas might have multiple syscodes, like Southern California is obviously huge, so they'll have a few. And the very first thing the eKey app needs when you run it is that serial number and syscode. It asks for it in the form of an obfuscated blob that you have to provide. Presumably you get that from your MLS association. Once the app has the serial number and syscode, it uses that as a credential to speak to their back-end web service. It's actually the only credential used. The web service will provide it with authentication cookies, and that's what they call them. They're just binary blobs of data. When you're attempting to open the iBox, the app will then transmit those cookies to the iBox over Bluetooth or IR. Now, the key to their security is that the agent must provide a PIN code, in addition to these cookies. And that PIN code is associated with their serial number or syscode up in Supra's server somewhere, and that's required to open the actual lock. The other thing I discovered when I reversed the app was that there's two authentication modes, programmed and deprogrammed authentication. Now, deprogrammed is rarely used. It's only used like if a lock is moving between syscodes, and if you're actually out in the wild and you're opening a house, you're going to be using programmed auth. Programmed auth is very complex, and there's a lot of cryptography involved in it. But from a very high level, what it looks like is you're going to be sending a cookie called the identity cookie, then you're going to be sending the configuration cookie, then you're sending an obtain key message that incorporates the PIN code, that user PIN code, then you're sending a key auth cookie, and then finally you're sending the device open message. And at that point, if all those cookies and messages pass a lot of different validations, then the device will actually open. And this can't be replayed. Additionally, all those cookies contain AES max, so you cannot modify them successfully. On top of that, the eKey app also sends what they call update bytes with every attempt to open a lock. And those change every single day. And the only way to even get them is from Supra's server, and they are themselves an AES MAC. Additionally, while the eKey is in a syscode and has a serial number, every iBox also has a serial number and syscode. And to open a particular iBox, for the most part, those syscodes must match. So it's getting pretty clear that we're going to have to access, that I had to access the firmware of the iBox to figure out anything else. For one, as an attacker, I don't have a valid serial number or syscode because I'm not a real estate agent. Even if I were able to obtain one via social engineering, I most likely wouldn't be able to obtain the PIN code as well. I'm not a very good social engineer. And finally, I don't want to communicate with Supra's server to obtain those auth cookies because then, I'll be leaving a trace that I was hacking and they'll come after me. So let's get the device open. To open an iBox, the first thing you need to do is cut off this hard plastic shell that surrounds the iBox, and you'll be left with just the metal underneath it. You'll need to remove a couple of hex screws. The next part's a little tricky because you got to open the key container. And the only way to do that is either use a legitimate eKey or an exploit. And obviously I haven't told you any exploits yet, so you'll just have to trust me that's possible. Now, if you're opening an iBox Bluetooth, it's a little trickier. You got to also cut off the shackle, and you have to pop 2 rivets on the back, and it's just a huge pain. You got to pry them up with a screwdriver and saw the tops off. I've done it a few times, and it's amazing. I still have all my fingers. When you can finally access the board, this is what you will see. The iBox is on the top and bottom is on the left, and the iBox Bluetooth top and bottom is on the right. As you can see, they both have a fairly large microcontroller on the top. That's the MSP. The Bluetooth LE is basically identical to the Bluetooth, except their Bluetooth chip is swapped out with a Bluetooth LE chip. So those MSPs, what you saw in the iBox, it's a 147, which is in TI's 1 series of MSPs, pretty old. The Bluetooth upgrades to an MSP in the 2 series. They both have a serial IR transceiver, which is actually bit banged, though the Bluetooth also has a ST Microelectronics Bluetooth serial module. Now, they both have EEPROMs as well, and the only thing really stored in the EEPROM is the visitor log. So every time you open a house, the device will store that a particular key opened this key box in that visitor log in the EEPROM. So this was my steps that I decided to take to reverse engineer the device. First, I decided to focus on the iBox, the traditional iBox. And the reason I did that is because, for one, that board is super easy to obtain. I don't need to pop those rivets and potentially lose fingers. As everyone here knows, older software is much more likely to be insecure, so it's a better target for that reason. And the important part is that the cryptographic material on both devices, or on all those models, is identical. The same eKey is used to open the older iBox as is used to open the the brand new Bluetooth LE. So if I can compromise the old iBox, I can open a brand new LE. So my process was first map out the test pads, and you can see I created this image as my own reference, and that's just via simple continuity testing and a data sheet. Find debugging interfaces and perform firmware extraction through those debugging interfaces. Now, generally, if you're going to perform firmware extraction against an MSP, you have two options. You have JTAG first, and there's 4-wire and 2-wire variants of JTAG, though the 147, which was my target, only supports 4-wire. And the first thing you notice when you hook it up is that the JTAG security fuse is blown, so JTAG is entirely prohibited. And that leaves us with BSL. A BSL is TI's Bootstrap Loader Protocol. It's a serial interface that permits read-write access to flash memory. Now, BSL is actually implemented using code that is stored in a special read-only, for this line of chips, in a special read-only memory region of flash. The problem with BSL is that nearly all access to BSL is restricted with a password. And cleverly, TI used the interrupt vector table. It's a 32-byte password from the interrupt vector table, which is inherently unique and secret. It's unique because every software project has different code, so they're going to have different interrupt vector addresses. And it's secret because I don't know your code. I'm trying to figure out what your code is. So obviously, I don't know what your interrupt vector addresses are as well. There's only one command that you can perform when you don't have that password, and that's a mass erase. And that'll erase all of flash, and it'll reset that interrupt vector table back to all Fs. And then it's a default password, and you can connect over BSL, but you've lost all flash. So in 2008, Travis Goodspeed released a white paper called Practical Attacks Against the MSP430 BSL, where he described two attacks. The first was a voltage glitching attack, and the second was a BSL password comparison timing attack. So I first attempted to perform the voltage glitching attack, and I had a GoodFet 22 kind of lying around, and that has an ADG 1634 on it, which is a digitally controlled analog switch. It allows you to switch between two analog inputs using a digital line. I used the onboard DAC on the GoodFet, which is the digital to analog converter, to define sort of the high and low voltages to glitch between during the authentication check. I removed the chip from the board to eliminate any kind of electrical interference like a capacitor, and I stepped down the power on all the data lines because the MSP runs on such low power that a full power data line will actually prevent glitching. Now, I should note that this attack is only feasible against BSL 1.x because in BSL 2.x they added a mass erase on the incorrect password. So obviously, if you're glitching, you're going to need to be performing lots of attempts at sending the incorrect password and then glitching. And if it erases all of flash on the very first attempt, then you're kind of screwed. But luckily for me, the 147 runs BSL 1.1. This attack was a failure. So when I attempted this, the device either continued running undeterred or died altogether. And I brute forced every possible low voltage to determine if there was a sweet spot between those two states where it would glitch. And I did not find one. And my conclusion is that the MSP430 in the GoodFet 22 is actually too slow to glitch another MSP. BSL runs around 1 megahertz, and the GoodFet, you can clock it up to 16 megahertz, but I still think that it's too slow to do glitching using that ADG. So I moved on next to the BSL timing attack. And what Travis discovered is that the password byte comparison has a single clock cycle difference between the correct and incorrect paths. If you look at this code here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but basically the code reads the interrupt vector table address, or gets it, and then it receives a byte, and every time it receives a byte, it compares that received byte to what the correct expected byte is. If they're not the same, then it takes an extra clock cycle ORing a NAC into a global, or Wilston NAC is what I call it, into the global state. So what Travis's approach was to send every possible byte, so like 0000, 32 times, 010101 32 times, FFFF 32 times, and send each, so that's 256 attempts, okay? And for each possible byte, measure the number of clock cycles the device takes to process each of those, and from there you can determine what the byte makeup of the password is. So what you would expect to see is all the bytes that don't appear in the password would have like a baseline amount of time that it takes, and then any byte that appeared once would be like 1 clock cycle longer, or twice take 2 clock cycles longer, and on and on. Now, since the device receives the byte in between each of these, you really need to think about what the communication looks like on the wire. Now, I mentioned it's serial, so there's 1 start bit, 8 data bits, a parity bit, and a stop bit. It's bit banged by BSL code. Now, the problem, the most significant problem, is that between the bytes, between the stop bit of 1 byte and the start bit of the next byte, the device will wait for that start bit to go low before doing its byte receive routine. And that's a busy wait. So it just says, is the line low? No. Do that again. And as soon as you've let it go through that loop more than just one single time, you've destroyed all prior timing information. Because then the processor or the microcontroller has busy waited for some indeterminate number of clock cycles, and we have no idea, how many clock cycles were taken in the past. Additionally, the device will check that the line is high after the stop bit, and if it's not, it'll cause an error. So let's look at this graphically. You see byte n-1 stop bit, and then the next byte start bit, and you see where the device checks, and then where all timing information is destroyed if that start bit line is not low. The time between those, the stop bit and the start bit, I call the interbyte timing. And obviously, we're going to want to calculate or determine what the ideal interbyte timing is so that we can perform this attack. Now, it's easy just to say the ideal interbyte timing is the number of instructions run times the clock speed. But what you quickly discover is that both the clock speed is highly inconsistent, and that's because BSL uses the software-based clock, the DCO clock. You can't force it to use a crystal because it's running its own code. But also, the number of instructions that are actually run vary due to the timing vulnerability itself. So you have no idea if 1 or more or fewer instructions ran. Additionally, any mistakes you make with a non-ideal interbyte timing will be multiplied by 34 times because you have 32 bytes plus a 2-byte checksum. So again, looking at it graphically, assume that the default state has a very large interbyte timing. And so in normal serial timing, the interbyte timing is too large, and the device will wake up before the start bit, and it'll busy wait until it sees that start bit. Now, in our case, since we're performing attack, that'll give us bad data because all that timing info is destroyed. Now, we're going to slowly decrease the interbyte timing to try to find the ideal, but say we take it too far. There's a couple bad things that could happen. For one, it could check that the stop bit is high when it's really still low, and that'll cause an error. Or the device could wake up after the start bit entirely, and that's a giant disaster because then it'll busy wait all the way until data bit 1, and then it'll think that's the start bit, and all serial communication will be bit shifted by 1. It's a big mess. If you're attempting to perform this attack on the target chip itself, which you don't know the password for, or rather if you're attempting to determine the ideal interbyte timing, you're kind of screwed. First of all, you don't know the password, and you don't know what the timing is. So if you get the timing wrong, if the device wakes up too early or something, you're going to get a knack. But since the password is inherently wrong, you're also going to get a knack. So there's no good way to determine the ideal interbyte timing when you don't know the password. You're always going to get a knack. Therefore, my game plan was to test this attack on a same model chip where the BSL password is known to find that ideal timing. I used an external crystal on my good FET, so I knew there were no attacker side problems. And I slowly decreased the interbyte timing until the correct password is no longer ACT. When I find the overall run with the lowest overall time, I know I've eliminated all those busy wait cycles. I know that it was still act, so I didn't go too far. I found the ideal interbyte time, and then I can take that interbyte time and I can use it against the target chip and perform the timing attack. And this is what I got. So as you can see, along the x-axis, I'm slowly decreasing the interbyte timing by a certain amount. And then on the y-axis, you see the total overall time it takes. And it's a linear decrease because I'm just linearly removing busy wait cycles until we reach a minimum. And at that point, the correct password is no longer acknowledged, and we found the ideal interbyte time. So that looks really good at the macro level. The problem is it's wildly inconsistent when you get down to the micro level. The overall time it takes to process the password varies by thousands of attackers' clock cycles, which is obviously just crazy. Keeping in mind that the attacker clock is running 16 times faster than the victim clock, but still, that's crazy. So the first thing I did was I attempted to modify BSL to expose the time at which it's actually testing the line by twiddling the RX line. By doing this, I was able to confirm that, I'm finding the ideal interbyte time, and it all looks, pretty good. But what I discovered is that regardless of that, the timing is still super inconsistent. And I believe this was mostly due to the DCO clock. So I tried just focusing on the very last byte of the password. And with the last byte of the password, if you just focus on getting that one byte correctly, then you only have to worry about the interbyte times that come after that. So you only have to worry about those 3 interbyte times for the last byte in the 2-byte checksum. This was my result. So this is with an ideal interbyte time, okay? I ran 10,000 times every possible byte guessing at that last byte of the password. And I measured the overall time. It took about 24 hours. What you would expect to see in an ideal world is the overall time taking to process that password is a flat line for every possible guessed byte, except for one, the correct byte. And that byte would be a single clock cycle lower. But instead, we have this. The attack was obviously a failure. I believe it was a failure due to the BSL's DCO clock, that software clock, has inconsistencies during what it calls the tear routine. So the way BSL determines the timing for serial is it measures the number of clock cycles that occur during its very first serial bit received. And it uses that timing, that number of clock cycles, to determine the timing for the rest of the serial communication. Effectively, the length of the sleeps in its serial communication. Now, if there's any inconsistencies in that number of clock cycles that it measures, that inconsistency will be multiplied for every single bit that it receives. So those errors will be vastly multiplied, and they don't appear to average out on the short term. So at this point, I was super frustrated. I had failed to perform both of the attacks that Travis described publicly, but fortunately, there's a third attack, the paparazzi attack. Now, this is a firmware extraction technique. Travis Goodspeed told me about it, and it permits bypassing the JTAG security fuse, and it's due to the photoelectric effect. Now, if you look at the JTAG security fuse on MSP430s, it splits into 2 categories. The first is the 1, 2, and 4 series of the MSPs, and those use a physical fuse. And to blow it, or program it, as they call it in their documentation, you physically blow it up by pumping a bunch of current into the chip in a certain state. Now, the 5 and 6 series of the chips use an electronic fuse, and that's just a region in flash that you write to. It's just a 4-byte address at 17FC. And this attack does not succeed against these chips. So focusing on the chips where the attack actually succeeds, the way you physically perform the fuse check is you toggle the TMS line while you keep the TDI line high. And the chip measures current that's pumping in through that TDI line across that physical fuse. And if it sees current passing across that physical fuse, it knows the fuse is intact, and it remembers that, hey, we're going to permit JTAG to occur. To perform this, the paparazzi attack, first thing you have to do is decap the chip. You're obviously going to want to keep your bonding wires intact because you're going to be doing electrical testing. So you might need to do jet etching for that. I don't play with acid, so I'm not really sure. I just send it off to a lab. It costs less than $100, and it's cheap and easy. So why not? Next, you're going to run a tight JTAG loop on the reset tap and fuse check operations, and for that I use a good FET firmware application. Now, every 200 iterations of that loop, you're going to attempt an authenticated action. Now, when I say an authenticated action, I mean an action, a command that requires the fuse to be intact. So what I just do is I just read the first address in BSL memory space. And the first word in BSL is at C00, and it's a pointer to the entry point of BSL code, which is at C02. So if I get anything from that memory read that is C02, I know I've succeeded. I've bypassed this fuse. While you're running this tight JTAG loop, you're going to expose the die and you're going to hit it with a camera flash. It's probably going to take a few times. When you get valid data, you've succeeded. And by valid data, I mean C02. At this point, do not power the chip down or flip the reset line. Obviously, this requires a good FET software modification because it likes to reset the chip all the time. I recommend that you power the chip externally during this attack. Don't use the good FET to power it because it tends to use a lot of current for some reason when you hit it with the flash. Do not expect the chip to be in a normal state. This should be fairly obvious. What I just do is I just read the BSL password and then reset the chip. And then I just do everything over BSL because it eliminates any kind of crazy stuff that can occur after you perform this attack. If you want, you can just dump the whole firmware, flash it to another chip that doesn't have the security fuse blown, and you're good to go. So why does this work? Now, the JTAG fuse check, as I mentioned, works by measuring current that's passing across that physical fuse. The photoelectric effect is an effect where transistors, when they're struck by photons, release electrons. I believe that the high-energy photons that are coming from the xenon flash on a camera, this is just standard digital camera, are causing current to appear to pass across that fuse. Now, I've heard an alternate theory that perhaps the UV radiation in the flash is causing the memory cell to get erased where the JTAG state is stored, like Bunny's attack on the PIC microcontroller, if you've seen that. But I think that's inaccurate because a digital camera flash produces minimal UV, and this attack is instantaneous when it works, whereas a UV, you generally need to expose it to UV for a lengthy period of time, like minutes. Let's see a demo. So first I'm going to plug in my chip. I have a 3-volt power adapter here. Okay, so the good FET started up. It attempted to perform JTAG, and it got the JTAG ID, which is 89, so we know that it's connected, the chip's behaving as normal, and is prepared to do JTAG. Next, it's going to do this thing where you read a certain register, and if you get 555 back, you know that the JTAG fuse is blown, and so generally at this point, any other JTAG stuff would fail. Now, the next thing we're going to do is start with that loop, and sometimes this works pretty much instantly. Sometimes it takes a long time. So hopefully we'll get lucky and it'll work instantly, but cross your fingers. I am on stage. So that wasn't too bad. I've seen worse. So you see we've read out the BSL password, 32 bytes. At this point, you can pass that to BSL and you can dump firmware. So let's talk about what I found when I actually dumped the firmware. A couple notes on reversing MSP430 firmware. The calling convention I saw was arg1 and R12, arg2 and R14, and remaining arguments are pushed to the stack. The return value is in R12, but if it's a 32-bit return, it'll also use R13 because it's a 16-bit processor. The only really interesting thing that I discovered in the actual process of reversing was that they do this thing where if it's a sparse index switch statement, they call this common helper function, and that reads the return address off of the stack where the call routine pushed it, and then it goes there and it finds this data structure that defines where you're going to jump. And so that's useful because IDA otherwise will not know what to do with that data. Another surprising thing I found is that about 25% of the firmware was actually dedicated to IRDA. And I didn't really know a lot about IRDA before this. The Supra bit bangs the IRDA. It's basically just serial, but it has a short pulse width. So you have normally in serial you would have a large bit width, but in this case the pulse width is smaller than the bit width. Now you can actually connect to a test pad on the iBox board, and you can sniff the raw IR electrical signals, and then you can read those with logic if you have a Soleil. It's easy to write a custom plugin to decode them. You can export them and post-process them into a PCAP, and when you do that, Wireshark, if you set the right data type, will open that PCAP up, and it'll decode everything above the link layer, which is just terrific and super useful. Let's talk about what I found in the firmware. So I found 4 things. The first was I discovered how the Supra crypto really works. You know, I had some kind of idea after reversing the app, but I didn't really know exactly how it works. The second thing I found is there's actually 3 authentication modes. I mentioned programmed and deprogrammed before. There's a third. Third, I found a hardware backdoor. And fourth, I discovered that the memory read-write command, which I knew about because the app uses it, is a command that's sent over IR or Bluetooth. And it only typically reads the EEPROM, which is where that visitor log is stored. But I discovered there's a hidden mode to it that permits reading and writing a small segment of flash. And you'll see why that's interesting. So first, all the crypto that I saw in the initial protocol, there's a bunch of keys, but it turns out that they're all either derived from or encrypted with 2 keys, 2 AES-128 keys. The first key I call the device key, and it's actually rarely used in the field, and if you do use it, you get a very high level of access. With this key, you can deprogram a device to move it to another syscode. I'll talk about this a bit more in a little bit, but the most important key on the device is called the syscode key. Now, the syscode key is the root of trust for all those normal operations that you're doing, opening the device. And most interestingly, it's shared among all those devices within the same syscode, within a geographical region. And cleverly, Supra ensured that these keys were never accessible to the eKey app. There's no way to get access to them in the eKey app. And they're not accessible via any of their remote commands. So it's impossible to extract them via their command structure. I was expecting to find some sort of backdoor to read out the keys, but I didn't. So when I saw the Supra, the syscode key, when it's provisioned into the device, it's via some, I believe, unknown process that happens at the MLS office. I don't know much about that, but the device must be in a deprogram mode to do it. And I assume they have some sort of authenticated channel to get access to those syscode keys. Anyway, once it's provisioned, a MAC key and an encryption key are derived from it. And those keys are used, for example, to validate cookie integrity, the MAC key, and to decrypt any ephemeral keys, any session keys that are transmitted, respectively. If you compromise this key, it's sort of the keys of the kingdom, because you can generate fake authentication cookies. You don't need to contact Supra server to do that. You can open up any lock in the entire geographical region, which means you're not leaving a trace. The next thing I discovered, the third auth mode. So this third auth mode is permits access to the visitor log in the EEPROM only. That's all it permits access to. But obviously that's only useful if the device has been opened before, because if there's nothing in the visitor log, it's useless to you. Now, the key to this is that it requires no auth cookies to access it. You just walk up, you say, hey, I want to use that third auth mode, and it says, here's your visitor log. Have fun. The important thing about the visitor log is it not only contains like contact information about the people who own the keys that connected and opened the lock, it also contains their serial number and syscode. And before we were saying, an attacker doesn't have a valid serial number and syscode, he's not a real estate agent. Now he has one. But the problem is you still don't have the PIN code associated with that key. Let's talk a bit about brute force. A PIN code is only 4 digits. Now the device has brute force protection, okay? If you try to brute force the PIN code live, it'll lock you out for 10 minutes every 10 attempts, okay? So I did a little napkin math, and that came to like about a week if you're waiting for those lockouts. The problem is that they're storing the lockout counter in the EEPROM. So you could build a device, if you have physical access to the board, that attempts to authenticate with an authentication cookie that you got using a serial number and syscode, and then you can do an online brute force of that PIN code, erasing the EEPROM every 10 attempts. And you could very quickly get a PIN code, and at that point you've effectively cloned an E-key. You can spoof a real estate agent. However, you still need to contact Supra's server every day, so it's not an ideal attack. So the hardware backdoor. I mentioned deprogrammed auth before, and I call it that because the Android app only uses that authentication mode if the device is deprogrammed. When I reversed the firmware, I discovered that you can actually perform that authentication mechanism when the device is programmed, but you need to know that super secret device key. When you know that device key, which is unique per device, you get the highest access mode, and you can do things like deprogram the device. You can overwrite keys, and it's likely only used by the MLS office. They must have some kind of secure channel to get access to those device keys, which I don't know anything about. However, the implementation of this auth mode contains the hardware backdoor. What it looks like in code is you see peripheral 3.1 go high, and then the very next instruction, peripheral 3.2 is tested. If it's still low, that is, if those peripherals are not at the same level, then the backdoor is in effect, and the actual authentication part of that authentication mode is skipped. And that's because they're connected. They're a resistor. You can desolder that resistor if you have board level access, and you get you can bypass that per device auth. You get that high level access mode. It turns out you can also destroy the resistor with a single drill hole in the back of an iBox if you know the exact right location. And then after that, you can open it up easily with deprogrammed auth. So at this point, we've discovered how to clone a key, but we still need to talk to Supra's server. We've figured out how to open up one particular box if we have it in front of us using a physical attack. But we haven't really achieved all our goals of being able to open up all the iBoxes in the geographical region without contacting Supra's server. And that's where the flash write plus erase attack comes in. So the keys, these secret keys are obviously not stored in the EEPROM because they would be trivial to read out. They're stored in information memory, which is a segment in flash. It's a small segment. And that segment is erased by the BSL mass erase, so you can't just perform the trivial attack of mass erasing the device and reading that segment because it'll be gone. Additionally, generally when these devices are performing when they're writing to flash, you have to erase flash between those writes. And the way they do that is, so say you send a memory write command using that hidden mode that allows you to write to flash, it allows you to write to this same segment. And the way it does that is it takes that segment as it reads it from flash, it copies it to a buffer on the stack, it then erases the segment of flash, it modifies the buffer on the stack however you requested, and then it writes it back. And it turns out that since the stack is in RAM of the microcontroller, RAM is not actually erased by the BSL mass erase command. So here's our attack. First, we use the hardware backdoor to authenticate, and that gives us the high level of access that we need to do a memory write command. We can do a memory write command to the information page at an unused location. We'll just twiddle a byte at somewhere that's not used. Now, when we do that, the device will take that page, copy it to a stack buffer, modify it, twiddle our byte, and then write it back to flash. Very quickly, before the stack gets changed significantly, we're going to reset that device. We're going to perform a mass erase of flash via BSL. And as I said before, mass erase is the only thing that you can do without access to the password. And then we're going to read RAM using BSL, since the password has now been reverted back to the default password. When I attempted this, it was great success. So I wrote a special good-fed application that counts clock cycles so that the stack didn't get modified. I run that application right before sending the memory write command. I send the memory write command, and that app resets the device, puts it into BSL mode. And at this point, at my leisure, I can mass erase the device and read out RAM. Obviously, you can only perform this attack once because it's destructive. You've destroyed that device. But it doesn't matter because you've extracted the syscode key, and you can now just go through your city or your neighborhood and just go wild. So I'm going to show you a demo. I'm actually going to show you a demo of the hardware attack because the flash write and erase attack does not demo very well. This is a Supra iBox. It is programmed. I purchased it on eBay. Someone probably, I don't know how they got it, but they sell these things all over eBay, and they're cheap, and you can pick them up. And as you can see, it's locked. Can't get access to it. And you can also see, well, you can't, but there's a very small drill hole in the back. Okay? So this uses Bluetooth to communicate with this Bluetooth to IR proxy device, which translates the IR to the device. So by a Bluetooth turned on, yes. Okay, so as you can see, this device just did a very simple the deprogrammed auth, and it succeeded. And as a result, the lock opens right up. At this point, if you remove this hex screw, which I put in for purposes of demonstration, the entire lock would actually fall apart, and you'd have access to the circuit board. And at that point, you can perform any kind of, like the flash write and erase attack. Okay, conclusions, solutions. We discussed these issues with Supra in June. They were very receptive to us, and they've been working on these issues since, and they tell us they're planning to deploy a solution in less than 60 days. If you're a manufacturer of another device that's doing something similar, I would probably recommend that you avoid storing your cryptographic secrets in general purpose microcontrollers flash memory, because these microcontrollers, they have a ton of debug interfaces, and very often what you think are the sort of the ways to lock those down, there might be ways to bypass them if you have tons of physical access to them. Thanks to a few guys on my team who helped me out with various parts, and obviously thanks to Travis Goodspeed for his tremendous prior work on this. So that's it, and any time for questions. Yes. Well, they do make secure storage devices. Like Atmel makes a secure storage EEPROM where you can keep keys in there, and they're intended to be protected against physical attacks. And then you can actually do the decryption of data on that chip itself. At this point, I probably bought like 8 of these devices. The iBox, the traditional iBox is pretty cheap on eBay. They're like about $30. The iBox Bluetooth and the LEs are a little more expensive, but it's not that bad. Yes. Uh-huh. Really? No, I didn't. That's interesting. And if you didn't hear what he said that you can calculate the exact current that's being released if you know the material that the fuse is made of. And, okay. Yes? No. I mean, so the very first message, so the question is, what about replay? The very first message that you send to the device is like connection start, and you send it the auth mode that you're going to use. So if you're using standard programmed auth, the very first thing it responds back to you with is a challenge, a random challenge. And that challenge, it's not actually, well, it's interesting. What it actually is they take a number of different timers on the device and they encrypt it with the device key, which is kind of interesting. Any other questions? How much time did I work on this? A long time. As you can see, I went through a lot of failures, and I was obviously working on this in like side time, so it took a long time. Yes, in the back. I'm sorry? Oh, so the only one I've actually performed this attack on is the 1 series, with that 147. But I believe that it would work against the 1, 2, or 4, but you know, that's my belief. Now, I did test it against the 5 series to confirm that it's not affected, which it was a BGA chip. It was a huge pain to solder onto those little balls. But anyway, so that's the only one I've really performed this against. Any other questions? All right, great. Thank you for your time.